Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to today's webinar. We have a great presentation lined up for you today, but before we get started, there are just a few general admin points to cover. First and foremost, please use the online question tool to post any questions that you have, and we will share them with our speakers. Second, if you experience any technical difficulties today, please use that same questions tool and a member of our admin team will be on hand to support you. And finally, just to note, today's session is being recorded and we'll be sharing a copy with you all via email in the coming days. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our speakers to get us started.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to this great session. I'm Romain Gauthier, co-founder and CEO of Didomi, and today with Ben, who's going to introduce himself shortly, we will discuss a survey that we commissioned a few months ago around the theme of privacy, and the general title is Privacy Made Positive and Why Good Privacy Sells and Bad Privacy Repels. And we'll go over some very interesting results that we saw in this survey. Before we get started, just a couple of words about Didomi. Didomi is a European company specialized in consent and preference management. So we are really experts on everything related to consent and preferences linked to compliance with GDPR and other regulatory frameworks. So we offer solutions that help our clients collect, store, and use consumer consents in a GDPR compliant way. We've been doing that for the past 4 years now, and have scaled nicely to equip now over 160,000 websites and mobile applications, and helping in their compliance program for consent, all like these nice brands that I'm really proud to support. So brands from all over the world and in various verticals. Ben, I'll let you introduce yourself and Securys, please.
Thank you, Romain. So we are Securys. We're a global privacy consultancy. We deliver a variety of services, including privacy as a service. Our focus is really on delivering practical privacy. So Privacy Made Positive is an offshoot of our Privacy Made Practical program. And this is really about trying to move away from compliance purely as a box ticking exercise and thinking about it much more as a holistic part of both an ethical commitment to behaving as a good corporate citizen, but also as part of trust building. So Romain, if you could move to the next slide. We have this philosophy which is behind how we operate as an organization, which is that you should think about privacy as a trust building as a trust building exercise, and also as a core part of your relationship with all of your stakeholders. So not just your consumer customers, but also your employees, your shareholders, and the wider community. And what we're trying to do is to demonstrate in this program that privacy delivers a meaningful return if you do it well. So that rather than being a pure cost center that is about being afraid of regulators or trying to avoid bad publicity, it's something you can use as a positive beacon to attract customers and employees and to build up everything from net promoter scores to employee motivation. So if we have a look more at the Privacy Made Positive program, this is a 3-phase project. We've been running this for more than a year now. Last year, we commissioned an economics research firm to look at the history, the performance history of ethical businesses and to see how ethics fits into the economic picture. We did that because there isn't fantastic available research on how privacy affects actual consumer purchasing behavior. That's what this phase is about. But we wanted to look in general at the interface between how people talk about privacy and how they talk more broadly about ethics and corporate behavior, and what happens in terms of the company's financial outcomes. And we found, and you can go and get the ebook for that from privacymadepositive.com, we found that ethical companies perform better they make more money, they make better returns for shareholders, they have a higher survival rate. So we thought, if that's true generally, what does that mean for privacy? In this phase, which has been very kindly sponsored by Didomi, we went out and commissioned Kantar to survey about 4,000 consumers, 4,200 consumers across GB, France, Germany, and Ireland, to ask them what they do about privacy, not just whether they care about it, but whether they've acted on it. And what you'll see in this presentation is the results of that research, which we think presents a compelling case for doing privacy as a positive activity to drive your bottom line return as much as a compliance project.
Thank you, Ben. So let's, without further ado, let's start with the survey results. As you said, very interesting outcome of this survey, in my opinion. So a lot of us are naturally convinced that privacy is something important and meaningful, and that's probably why we work in this field. But it's always interesting to confront that intuition to what actually people think, and there the results are really, I think, outstanding for some of them, and we're happy to present them to you. Starting with like a fairly general question about what people understand about privacy at this point, and how they perceive it. Maybe like Ben, you want to like share some thoughts about this initial slide?
Sure. I mean, we obviously had to start the survey by getting some kind of context. You can't dive straight into saying what have you done about privacy without finding out whether people know what it is. I think it's clear that the GDPR in particular and the marketing campaigns that everybody from the EDPB downwards has conducted have resulted in consumers having a reasonably good idea of what personal data means. And that ties into verifying, I guess, on our part, other studies that have shown the level of concern. We looked at a number of previous studies, and our results are broadly in line that 3/4 of consumers, roughly speaking, are concerned about what's going to happen to their personal data in the context of almost all consumers knowing what that means. The only thing I think that is new and interesting about this slide was the contrast between the level of concern in Germany and the level of concern in other countries. And there's an almost perfect correlation between a kind of, if you like, an instinctive feeling about how active the data protection authorities are being in each of those countries and the corresponding level of concern by consumers. So if you think about how active, and you'd almost say aggressive, German DPAs are being at the moment, particularly visibly around Schrems 2, but also in other areas, and you look at how much press volume and activity that CNIL has generated in France, it's not really that surprising that Germany and France have fewer concerned consumers, or a lower level of concern in consumers, than GB and Ireland. Clearly the ICO has come in for some criticism about its relatively low level of enforcement. And as we know, there was that recent study that showed that the vast majority of complaints to the DPC in Ireland are being ignored. So I think there is something here about context, and the work of DPAs is appreciated by, understood by consumers. So that helps understand, therefore, as an organization, what you're working against, if you like. If you're trying to promote yourself, you've got a bigger job to do to build trust in GB and Ireland than to some extent you do in Germany and France.
I fully agree with that, and I'll just add that I think on top of like the activity and the various scandals driven by like an intense media coverage of privacy over the past years, I think something fairly new happened as well. Is privacy has started to become very visible, and as a consent management solutions, we are well placed to understand that. The first thing that you now see on most European websites are cookie banners, so like a company asking for consent to run some trackers on their website or mobile application. And I think this has also like an effect on the fact that people are suddenly realizing that some things happen on the background related to their personal data. And yeah, I think they are started to worry about it because for most of them, I think it's still something that is not really clear and not very well understood, maybe too complex, but clearly like has an effect, I think, in people understanding and realizing that like privacy is something that happens on a daily basis, basically. Second, learning from this survey were questions around gender and age and differences that could be seen there. I must admit on my side that the results, especially related to age, were a bit counterintuitive because like I considered that like maybe I fall into the narrative that there were on one hand digital natives, so people very familiar with technology and therefore maybe realizing more the risks associated with the usage of this technology, in particular for their personal data, and the narrative around the digital illiteracy. So the idea that the older you get, the less you're familiar with the new tools that emerge all the time. And that's actually not what we see in the figures, and something that I found also very interesting. What do you think, Ben?
Yes, I agree. I mean, we came into this with the expectation that we would see probably an inverted bell curve, that you would expect to see that millennials essentially were the least concerned, that, you know, perhaps you'd see older people being more concerned out of a general fear of change, and that the Gen Zs were, you know, the digital natives who would be alert to what was going on. There are lots of ways you can explain this data. It's dangerous to try to overinterpret it because, you know, we're going to be reaching conclusions on the basis of assumption. But I think there are a couple of things that are reasonably straightforward. One is that the basic level of concern remains higher than I expected. You know, to see that there is a minimum 40% concern in Germany and a minimum 60% concern in Ireland shows that everybody has a level of concern. And I think we'd expected to see significantly lower levels of concern in some age groups. It is possible that this is partly to do with how much you have at risk. The older you get, by and large, the wealthier you become, the more data you've accumulated, and therefore the more you're conscious of being exposed. There certainly have been a lot of campaigns to alert older people to the risks of being scammed, and that may be driving this. I think the other thing that's going on here is that we saw with things like the WhatsApp scandal about their privacy policy, that there is a degree to which the millennials, whom we kind of dismiss as having handed over all of their data, are not behaving that casually, and they are alert to what's going on, which perhaps suggests why that center of the graph is filled. But I think what this tells us is that the concern is real, and that ultimately those people with the greatest disposable income, remembering that what we're talking about here is the impact of privacy on your commercial outcomes, are the most concerned. So they are the ones where that trust needs to be built. Clearly, we would expect, given how long now data and the internet have been a feature of our lives, we would expect that this is the pattern, that the older you get, the more concerned you become, and therefore it's part of your growth picture for your consumer base. I thought the gender contrast was very interesting. That was again something we didn't particularly expect. And most notably in Ireland, where there's a 10% difference between men and women in terms of the concerns they're expressing. And this ties back to the fact that even now, women are the primary controllers of domestic spending. So again, if you take out the men from this, you see there is a higher underlying level of concern. And so if you want to build trust in, for example, an FMCG environment, or in selling things like cars, where although we think of men as being the people who think about cars, it's actually women who predominantly make the purchasing decisions, you need to be focusing on that trust building, without wanting to gender your communication. You do need to be alert to this extra level of concern. Romain.
Right. I think it's it shows that as a company, you even if you don't care about privacy, if you care about your revenue, there are some interesting insights that you can take out of this survey. So there is a segment of your purchaser, consumers that care, and from a marketing standpoint, especially, I think it's getting more important to start building dedicated strategy. I think, and I preach for my church here, like giving back control to the users over their personal data is one of the solutions you have. Obviously, it's not enough. I think in general, companies need to work on transparency and clarity of their positioning with respect to privacy. But yeah, this survey, I think, are a good way to realize that this has an impact that could be meaningful, especially if you target specific segment of the population. Like another interesting figures that I think will resonate well with the privacy officers because they have probably seen that over the past years. So a form of increase of customers complaining or using their rights since GDPR happened. People are getting more aware that their personal data comes with specific rights and are ready to use them, and so we see that across all countries in a meaningful way, and something that I think is not really well understood by most companies to date, and from my perspective, what I see with these results is that as a company, more people knowing their rights will translate into higher risks, and it's not necessarily like the compliance risk of getting fined, but rather the reputation risk. As for any other parts of your user experience, if you perform badly with these like the small portion of your customers that are really wanting to go as far as like deleting their data, getting access to their data, and so on and so forth, I think you need to probably over-invest in that field, because the reputation risk is pretty massive, and as you can see, like 50% of people have exercised their rights over their data, which means they don't do that all the time, but whenever they feel it's required, whenever trust is broken, whenever something bad happened in their customer journey, they are ready and know how to do that. So something very critical there, I think, from a company standpoint.
Yes, I agree. I think what's interesting about this is that here we're seeing effectively the reverse profile to the previous slide. So although we know that older generations are more concerned, younger generations are more active. And here what we're talking about is data subject rights exercise. We'll talk a bit later about actual purchasing behavior. But this has two consequences. The correlation here is two things. On one, clearly, this is about the effectiveness of privacy communication. So it's clear that younger people have a better understanding of technology, and as you know, as a corollary of that, it's potentially clear that we are not communicating successfully with older people. If they're more concerned but exercising their rights less often, it suggests that they don't understand how to do it, which suggests to me that our privacy notices are not speaking to them effectively. Particularly if, for example, your primary communications channel for your organization is Twitter, then you're going to be excluding the majority of older generations. At the same time, if the younger generations are this active, then as they get older and become more concerned, you're going to have a perfect cross of concern and activism. And that suggests to me that we need to act now to avoid storing up trouble for the future. So I think this is just another reminder. I mean, clearly anyone in the audience who's a DPO will know that the rate of DSARS is increasing. And I think it's a reminder that that's something we should anticipate continuing over time. Romain, back to you.
Right. A very interesting aspect of the survey was the following. So surveying about what people, what consumers feared the most. And so while there were some things that were expected, I think one outstanding learning from this survey was how much people care about understanding and controlling for what the data is used. and being very worried and fear that their data is used for other purposes than the one they expected. And that's something that we see in all countries, and that was quite a surprise then.
Yeah, I think this was the first result that really surprised us. It's not a shock at all that identity theft is the top concern. We know that people are, in the same way that most organizations, when you first engage them around privacy, tend to conflate it with confidentiality. We know that consumers are primarily concerned about breach. But what was really interesting was how concerned they were about extension of purpose. I think if you'd asked this question 5 years ago, people wouldn't have known what extension of purpose was. And so here we are instead seeing that across all 4 countries, extension of purpose is right up there as a top fear. So, and that clearly will have arisen in part from Cambridge Analytica and the awareness now that data, once you've lost control of it, can be used for all sorts of things that you weren't expecting. But to see that ranked so highly really surprised me. I think seeing data for international transfers being a consumer concern was also a surprise to us. We tend to think of that as a technical concern. Clearly, it's something DPAs are very exercised about, and so it's something we're doing a lot of work on. But at the same time, to see that consumers are alert to it, I think is something we weren't anticipating. There are some interesting geographical variances there. It's a particular concern in France, and I think that's partly because the CNIL has been very vocal about this, and there have been some quite public investigations of particularly COVID data leaving France. I think then, the other concerns, we were surprised to see health data misuse being, relatively speaking, low down. It's still in the top 5. But there's a sign there that people are still prepared to place certain interests ahead of privacy. So I think the question will be, as the proximate threat from COVID diminishes, should we be concerned about people becoming more anxious about what's happening with health data? There's going to be a long tail of health data collection, and I think people will become alert to that as we swing away from what has been a fear-driven response. But I think for me, the drum I want to bang here is that consumers genuinely care what you do with their data apart from whatever your original stated purpose for collection was, and therefore you should not be overly relaxed about extending purpose without properly communicating to consumers. Comment?
Right, proper communication and probably also like more control. I think the French results are particularly interesting because you can see how much people care about also transfers of their data outside of their home country, which I think is a sign of a need for more control overall, and for making sure that the data is protected. So we've seen earlier that consumers understand GDPR is a protective regulation. They are understanding their rights, and now they want to make sure that somehow they can regain control over the data that they cannot lost, and that GDPR is offering them an opportunity to regain. So as a company, I think there are clear action points to work harder on transparency and control overall, because otherwise I think this could backfire. I think the more time goes, the more likely it is for a company to backfire and to damage reputation, and maybe also to be a name and shame for the data protection authority. It happens, and I think that's something that also strikes me, is that it didn't happen 2 years ago, but last week, none of your business complained, sent out complaints for 500 companies at once about their cookie policies and banners, and this resonates. So then there is a lot of media coverage, and you can feel that people are really starting to understand what's happening, and for some taking action. So, but again, extension of purposes. So the idea that your data could be used for something else, I think is really if there is one learning out of this survey, I think it could be this platform. Okay, so maybe to like summarize a bit in terms of action points, the few learnings we covered. I think it's clear that the consumers are now aware and engaged with your privacy notices and other materials. So don't overlook them as a company. It has an impact on their behavior, on how they perceive the company, how they are going to consider you as a trusted partner for a purchase or any form of relationship. The older the consumers get, the more concerned they are, and also like the more care you need to put for this type of your audience. And again, we fall back on the extension of purpose and transfer. So basically the idea that anything outside of what is expected by the consumer is generating fear and concern and could backfire for you as a company. Anything else, Ben, that you wanted to
add?
I
think you've covered it. I mean, really, I think what this was setting the background that said that consumers are much more engaged with privacy than perhaps you might think, that it is across a wider age range than you might think, and that they care about issues that you might have thought were only really discussed within the Privacy Office. So I think all of those things tell us that the existing obligation to transparency is backed up by a very strong demand for it from the consumer audience.
Yes, and like maybe before we move on, there is the opportunity to ask questions in the chat. So obviously, feel free to send us questions. We'll save some time at the end to cover these questions, and are happy to answer anything any question that you have. Let's move on to I think one of the most interesting part of this survey is how privacy affects company revenue, and in particular any form of purchase, which I think is a very important aspect of privacy. So if you think privacy is part of your customer relationship, then there is something that will emerge out of this pillar of your customer relationship. Actually, at Didomi, we see that and measure that for our clients. We've built over time what we call consent analytics. So the idea to measure really the link between consent and behaviors on our clients' websites, mobile applications, any digital channels. And really, it's amazing to see that first, most companies have no clue about their consent rate, also their addressability rate. So how many people, for instance, are going to bounce, so to leave your website because you interrupted them with all your cookie questions on the first page, and this is like something that is very intrusive and like improper for their navigation. So a lot of people prefer to leave, and sometimes the bounce rate is over 50%. So it means that whatever marketing budget you put into your advertising, your marketing, half of it is wasted because your privacy notice was not built adequately. And so this relationship between consent and revenue, for me, is completely underestimated by most companies. And like the good news is with this survey and with the tools, privacy officers have now a form of a formal way or proof to the importance of privacy, and can defend that with their colleagues. But we are still, I think, at the very early days of that, and there is a lot of education needed to really put the light on this question on how much privacy is going to affect your revenue as a company. For some publishers, we know that without consent, they lose half of their revenue because they depend on advertising, and that's just how their business model works. I think for any company, that's a valid question that needs to be asked and addressed, and that's where I think the privacy officer has a major role to play in his organization.
Thanks, Paul. I think it's important to say this is part of a wider question around privacy as a contributor to brand. And so we're not just talking here about privacy notices, we're talking about everything you have done to contribute to the public perception of you as a good steward or not of people's personal data. Some organizations have made substantial investment in publicizing their commitment to privacy. You know that Apple are doing this as perhaps the most notable player at the moment in that space. And what we were surprised to find was how much attention to the privacy element of brand and brand trust was paid by consumers, to what extent that contributed. Seeing that, across the whole of Europe, you're talking about 20% of people frequently pay a great deal of attention to privacy as part of their purchasing decision, double that in France. Again, France seems to have something of an outlier character here. And that you're up in the sort of 70 to 80% bracket for people who are paying at least some attention to privacy as part of their relationship with a brand and with, therefore, a purchasing decision. I think that's a much higher number than we anticipated. And it goes to, when you look at the later slides, it goes to the very surprising numbers that we found of people who engage privacy as part of their active purchasing decision. So perhaps we should move to looking at some of that functional numbers.
Sure. So, second thing that we surveyed is how much people are willing to pay for better privacy. So that's like a tricky topic, and to be honest, I'm not sure it's well understood by organizations. What we can learn, I think, out of this graph is that there is a significant portion of users who are really willing to pay to maintain their privacy. So first, it's a service that has a lot of value, and for 1/3 of your audience in any European country, there are people willing to maintain that and pay for it. So as a company, I think it asks a very a serious question. So how do you should you treat that? If this is a service, if it's part of all the services and products you deliver to your consumer, where does it go? I really like what the gaming industry is doing in this perspective. So the idea that when you play a free game, your onboarding is very progressive. So you will not be asked for money right away. You will start finding out the value of the game, if it's entertaining, if it's addictive, and so on. And after a while, so after you've hit the point where you're convinced this game is nice, you're asked for a form of payment. Sometimes it's optional, so it doesn't prevent you from playing, but it accelerates your game. And I really think that privacy is a similar form of service. So by default, no personal data should be collected, and it's a progressive thing to ask for permission to use and process personal data, and it's also a way to to showcase the value that you put behind the data of your consumers. So I think it's really beneficial to have this approach. So that's my 2 cents on this tricky question. Ben, what do you think about this?
It's a tricky question. I think it's important to start by saying this is not about asking people to pay for things that are rights conveyed in law. This is about starting from a baseline, which is the right to privacy that is conveyed to consumers by the law that is available to them, and then thinking about, well, what's the benefit of doing better than that? And that will vary depending on where you are. If you're in the European Union or in the UK, where you have this very high starting point in terms of guaranteed privacy, you've got to work quite hard to differentiate yourself, but there is value there. I think if you're in countries where there is less of an overarching privacy regulation, then this reinforces the fact that you can make a competitive differentiation for yourself by doing privacy more effectively. I think there are 2 things that this leads to. There are 2 different strategies. They're complementary, but they're different things. One is this question about how people pay for services. This famous saying that if the product is free, it's not the product, you are. We have become used to the idea that particularly internet services are funded by advertising, which fundamentally means consumers are paying for the service with their personal data. They make, in theory, a conscious exchange of personal data for service or convenience, and that personal data is then effectively resold to advertisers to fund the product. And all products have to be funded. Nothing is actually free. So one option is to charge people for the service rather than make them pay with their data. If you think about Strava, to pick another example of a company that's taken a stance on this, they have taken the view that they're not going to sell personal data and they will fund their service by charging a subscription. That does mean that the subscribing users are effectively subsidizing the free users, and it is the job of the company to make it attractive by adding additional functionality for people to migrate from the free service to the paid one. But we have here something like a third of consumers or more who are apparently prepared to pay with money as opposed to paying with data. The other thing you can do is to do privacy better and charge a premium. So privacy becomes part of your competitive strategy, and as a consequence, your prices are higher. And that's Apple's play, right? Apple are saying, we're going to do privacy better than Google, and you're going to pay more for an iPhone than you are for a Shenzhen generic Android, but in consequence, you can be confident that your data are more secure. And I think that's clearly a strategy that is working for Apple. It's not the only reason people buy iPhones or pay a premium for them, but it's part of it. And that is something I think we will see more of. You can hold yourself up as a better steward of data than the competition. You can do better privacy, be more secure, do more minimization, do less extension, sell less data or none, and as a consequence, charge higher prices. And I think that's something we haven't seen people really adopting broadly in the market. And it's partly because of the gap between privacy as a box ticking compliance function on the one hand and marketing as a completely separate silo that sees privacy only really as an obligation and an onerous burden. And I think we need to see a change here where your privacy posture is part of your brand value. And so it's part of your marketing function as well as your compliance function.
I think it's a great transition with the next result, which is how much privacy drives trust, which I think is an open question to this date. We know how much brands represent in the assets of large companies. Apple, for instance, is the most valuable brand in the world and worth dozens of billions of dollars. And I think that privacy is part of your brand, and so it's really an asset that is worth cultivating. One of the reasons why it's worth cultivating is that it's an asset that really not doesn't deprecate over time. So it's something that when you acquire trust, it has a lot of value and will stick, will last. Of course, it can be destroyed fairly easily, but it's the kind of asset that I think companies and in general are probably underestimating the value of investing in privacy and how much this can reinforce the brand and therefore the brand value overall. So something which I expect we see more companies see as an opportunity in the coming years, probably following the path of Apple, and maybe it could also become a new form of standard as well, just like everything you do with your environmental responsibilities are becoming a form of standard. We could also see that because consumers really start caring a lot about how their privacy is handled by companies, this could also become a standard. This probably is a bit of speculation, and I'm probably extrapolating a bit here, but I think it's something that where we are still in the very early days of this realization that brand value incorporates trust, and that trust is directly impacted by how you handle privacy.
I think almost very kindly signposting what we're doing in the next phase of Privacy Made Positive, where we will be working with investors to develop an ESG standard for privacy. So we did find in the phase 1 research that investors were increasingly concerned with the S and G bits of ESG. So it isn't just about green, it's also about good corporate citizenship, and privacy is part of that. But I think thinking about this from a consumer perspective, what we're saying here is two things. We're saying clearly that good transparency will drive trust, but obviously poor transparency will damage trust. And I think if you look at the migration from WhatsApp to Signal, that is clearly a consequence of poor transparency. It's clear that not only is what Facebook are trying to do with amalgamating WhatsApp data into the larger Facebook org, perhaps challenging from a privacy perspective, but their communication about it was poor, and that resulted in this jump from a couple of 100,000 signups to Signal to 8.8 million in the week where the story broke. So we don't need to look very far for external evidence that our survey is borne out by reality. Let's move on one more to seeing how people then use all of this. So shall I start on this one, then you pick up, just to change it around? I mean, this for me, this is why we did the study. This is what we were really aiming to look at. And it is, okay, we've asked a lot about how you feel and what you're concerned about and whether you care. And lots of other surveys have done that too. The questions we asked that had not been in other surveys is, what have you done as a consequence? What measurable, concrete thing have you done as a consequence of your privacy attitude? And we found that a substantial number of people across all 4 countries had specifically selected product or specifically signed up for a service because of better privacy. They had included, privacy had been the driver in their selection criteria. Equally importantly, a significant number, it varies slightly more by geography, the Germans are less keen on this, but between 45 and 70% of people have decided not to buy something because they were not confident about its privacy. They reach, it's a basket abandon moment. They reach some point in the purchasing decision process and go, just not comfortable with what you're doing or proposing to do with my data, I'm not doing it. And I think that's hugely important if you think about your basket abandon rates, you think about how many customers you're potentially losing. And then finally, you get these groups in the sort of 50% range who have cancelled something. They have stopped buying a product or they have cancelled the service because they are concerned about its privacy abuses. That will be people leaving WhatsApp and going to Signal. It will be people switching from Android to Google. It will be people deleting Facebook. This is real, and this is people acting on privacy, not just caring about it. And that means there's actual dollars or euros or pounds, or pick your currency of choice, at stake here. You have something like 60% of consumers accessible to you as likely purchasers if you do privacy well, and you have something like 2/5 of consumers at risk if you do privacy badly. And I think this for me, this is what we wanted to show in the study. And I was actually surprised that the numbers were this high. We didn't think privacy, what Cisco called privacy actives, had become this prevalent. Or more.
No, I think you're right. From Didomi perspective, we kind of uncovered that through what I discussed earlier, like measuring the effect of concentrate or opt-out rates to the revenue of some of our clients. And you see that a slight change in your opt-out rate can have massive consequences in your revenue, because people who cancel the service or stop buying from you, you're losing that after having spent a massive amount of marketing, advertising money to acquire these customers. And this is it's the most dramatic thing that can happen to a company. And so this the hidden cost of privacy, I think, is clearly not perceived correctly by most companies out there. And so typically what we do with our clients, we try to model the relationship between their concentrate and their revenue, and how an increase or a decrease of their concentrate is going to affect their bottom line. and that's clearly like I think the right way to look at privacy, because it speaks to the marketing team, and it's also like clearly show the value of privacy in any customer relationship. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to necessarily optimize for more consent in ways that are in ways that consumers will not understand. As we see, surprise is clearly not a good idea when you talk about personal data. But working on that and really trying to make sure that it's something that is measurable, and so that you can clearly assign goal to is really important for companies. And yeah, I think this part of the survey is not about future things or like optimism. Is really about showing that poor privacy has really a hidden cost for companies. And I think the starting point there for any company is to start measuring that seriously and act on that.
I think if we look at the distribution across countries, two things really stand out. I mean, one is that we don't see an enormous number of people frequently doing this, and that doesn't surprise me, because most of the time when you're buying things, privacy is not going to be your primary concern. The issue, of course, is that if your product is data intensive or your service is data intensive, then you're likely to be in that frequent blue group. But also that every lost customer is lost money, and every one customer is additional money. So it doesn't take very many positive or negative decisions to make a difference to your bottom line. For me, the real surprise was the size of the orange bars, the people who are occasionally doing this. And we would expect to see that migration down into the blue groups, the people who do it occasionally start to do it more frequently over time. This reflects the difference between our findings and Cisco's in 2019, where they had about a third of people who frequently or occasionally, and now we are at something like 2/3 of people in some countries, in France notably. Here you can see more of that expected age demographic difference, that it is more strongly a characteristic of younger consumers. This is, again, not a surprise. We already saw that privacy information communicates better to them. They are much more digitally savvy. But again, we were surprised to see that, broadly speaking, it was consistent across all age groups and all countries. The inter-country variations are not that dramatic. There's this strange outlier going on in GB with Gen X's, which I don't think we can explain without doing more research. There's still a substantial number of them, it's still 40%, but for some reason GB Gen X's appear to be slightly, less active on the privacy front. On the other hand, if you look at France, French Gen Zs are clearly the most concerned in Europe, and therefore the most privacy active in Europe. If you are selling things in France, you need to have privacy as a central selling proposition, because something like 70% of French Gen Zs frequently or occasionally buy things on the basis of privacy. So I think this tells us that effectively attitudes across Europe are relatively consistent, and that they are relatively consistent by age, both of which I think were things we found slightly surprising. But above all, it's the overall level. It's the fact that you're hitting that 60% line almost all the time. So 3/5 of consumers are actively selecting on privacy.
Thanks, Ben. I think we can quickly wrap up this second part with a couple of comments there about how like privacy adds like value to your brand, to your customer relationship, and how like investing in that in a visible, transparent, comprehensible way is going to have a meaningful impact on your revenue, on your bottom line, and that across Europe, across generations, and yes, something I think fairly new and worth digging into as company, as marketers, and also like from a privacy officer standpoint, a good way to to explain to your colleagues why they should pay attention to these privacy notices that you're building. Something that, yeah, I think is a form of a drama in certain organizations where like GDPR has been seen and is still considered as a strict compliance play, and sometimes has a very bad press in some organizations, while it matters and it could affect significantly your competitiveness in most countries in Europe that we survey. Okay, I think we have a bit of time for questions. Ben, you wanted to wrap up as well, maybe.
Why don't we there's one question about where we've done this study, and the answer is, so far we have done this only in those 4 countries, in GB, France, Ireland, and the US. There's a fairly simple reason for that, which is that doing this work is very expensive and there is a limit to our budgets, so we haven't yet extended these surveys. We would be very interested to talk to anybody who wanted to partner with us to extend this study out into particularly the US or Asia. I think it's also, partly about the GDPR as a leading driver of privacy consciousness. So we were wanting to see what the impact of the GDPR had been. But we do intend to continue this program, and we will, subject to finding the money, extend it globally over time. So we have another question. Romain, do you have a view on Clubhouse? And the question was, what are your takes on the Clubhouse trends in view of privacy, especially since 60% of its users being underage children?
I have no particular views on Clubhouse, though. I think it's there are some fashion that burst and decrease, so it's hard to, I think, distinguish the driver of that. But about underage children and privacy, I think it's a very important risk. As a father myself, I'm starting to realize how fast it goes, and how I think lack of education and just being a child is exposing you so much in terms of privacy abuse, and so from a company standpoint, I think it requires extra care. And for instance, at Didomi, we have a feature called delegated consent that help us collect, give back control over personal data to parents. It's a topic that I think is still new and hard to tackle for organizations. But it's going to be even more critical that children are really in desperate need for some time to be protected, and it's something very new in our age that we probably are still learning the hard way.
Yeah, I think
extending the question exactly, but I think we didn't touch on underage children, and I think it's something that for organizations is really worth even more care and investments if you happen to have this type of audience.
Yeah, extending beyond Clubhouse, I think there's a huge appetite in Europe for enforcement around processing data on children. As you know, it's a focus at the moment for new regulation, and also for significant investigation in a number of countries. There is a huge tech opportunity here. There are a number of people, including Didomi, who have products that allow you to verify parental consent. We didn't do, in our study, we didn't look at children. We only looked down to age 16. Partly because it's very difficult to do that kind of research, and partly because we're looking really at consumers with significant disposable income. But I think the issue with things like Clubhouse is we still are in a universe where people will selectively sacrifice their privacy where there is sufficient appeal. And this is where the balance is between regulation and the market. What we are showing is that in most conventional product and service sales, the market ultimately drives the demand for privacy. People want it, and therefore if you have it, they will buy your thing rather than somebody else's. Where you're looking at those things that particularly for children, that are faddish and trend driven, I think that's a different question entirely. So we do still need that regulatory and compliance side for services like TikTok and for Clubhouse and for all of these things and Instagram, where you find children present on platforms where they really shouldn't be, or at least where their parents need to be much more aware. But I think, from the point of view of Privacy Made Positive, what we're trying to say is that there are two pillars. There is the compliance pillar, there is the regulatory pillar, which is about society deciding what is acceptable. But then there is the market pillar, which I think gets overlooked, which is about whether or not people will actually pay for things. And it's noticeable that most of the things we're talking about where there has been significant issues with children's data are also free, or at least they're paid for with data, which is the entire scandal. So part of this is perhaps if we see a greater transition to services being paid for at the point of consumption rather than being paid for with data, we can also do something about the problem of children's data being exploited. Do we have time for another question, or should we move on to concluding remarks and pointing people to the next webinar?
Maybe like a final question very quickly. Do you believe the recent Data Service and Data Market Act might somehow have an impact over the statistics? Any thoughts on that, Ben?
I would have said not in this particular case, because the study was done in February. These attitudes will, there will be some impact from events at the time, but at the end of the day, we're asking people what they have done, not what they propose to do. So some of the data around awareness perhaps, but in general, we're talking about what have you done over the last X months. I think also this is more likely to be being driven by news flow, and I think that's the other thing to bear in mind. The lesson I would take from this is that consumers' perception of your privacy doesn't just come from your privacy notice. It comes from everything that they know you do, and that includes what they read in the news. It includes what you say in all of your marketing material. Your privacy notice is to some extent, the Cinderella in that. It's the thing they go to last. They will start with what do they perceive from, social media and television and advertising and news flow. And so it's very important that your privacy office and your marketing team work together to present your organization appropriately, and that behind that, your organization actually behaves appropriately so that you're presenting the truth.
Thank you, Ben. I think that's a great conclusion. Many thanks to the participants. It was a pleasure presenting you these survey results. The ebooks is with all the details about the survey and these results is available on Didomi website and on like Privacy Made Positive website as well. So feel free to download it. I think we also distributed the document in the chat if you want to upload this presentation. Many thanks again, and we have another session planned for July 22nd, so a month and a half from now, where we'll present you further results that we commissioned with this survey, and it'd be a pleasure to see you there. Thanks a lot. Have a nice end of the day.
Good day, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity, Romain. Good to speak to you again.
Same here.